So good morning, Mike and Chris.
Good
Good
morning.
morning.
Good morning, everyone on Facebook and online. And so my name is Zarah Wendy, and I am an energy healer, mentor, and coach. And I wanted to introduce my co-host today, Mike Doherty, who is also an energy healer and a student of Carl Jung, and interested in psychology and meditation. And so Mike and I have been in the same Carl Jung reading group for a bit, and Mike has also studied energy healing with me and opened his own center here in the Philippines called Gaia Center. So good morning, Mike. and,
Good morning, Wendy.
and I wanted to introduce, of course, Chris Luard. Some of you might know from previous collaborations over YouTube. And so Chris is a meditation teacher. He's been teaching meditation for many, many years. And he just revealed that he has 300 episodes of meditation talks over on YouTube, I guess, Chris, right?
Yeah, YouTube, Instagram,
So
Facebook.
so you guys can check those out. Plenty of resources for you guys to look at there. And so Chris is joining us this morning from Chiang Mai in Thailand. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about mindfulness practice, meditation, and how to be mindful of navigating trauma when we're using some of these techniques, which is so relevant always because trauma is a part of our human experience, but all the more so this year. I feel like 2020 is like the year of trauma. I don't know if you guys feel the same way,
Yeah.
but
Yeah,
I
big
think for
collective
many,
trauma.
I think for many people, they're gonna find that that's the case. So I'll leave you guys the floor and happy to
Okay.
enjoy this talk.
Well, thank you, Wendy, and thank
Yeah,
you,
thank you.
Chris.
Thank
But
you.
yeah, I had some questions just about trauma. I guess one of the first questions is something that I think we all should discuss. What is your definition or the definition of trauma?
Well, trauma, I would define trauma as any sort of experience which activates the fight or flight response and freeze response, fight or flight or freeze response. Any sort of experience that creates that reaction in our nervous system. So trauma can be differentiated between trauma and traumatic stress, because we all can have a traumatic experience and assimilate that experience, and we don't end up in a traumatic stress situation where we're holding on to the adrenaline, the energy that gets cultivated in that experience like that. So trauma, we all have traumatic experiences. We've all had that. In fact, going to see a horror movie is a traumatic experience. But because we recognize that it's fiction, that we're in a safe place, that we don't need to run out of the movie theater when we see Jason in a hockey mask coming at us with an axe, right? We can assimilate the adrenaline. We can assimilate the response of the nervous system. Well, hopefully anyway. And so we don't leave the movie theater in a traumatic stress situation. The real issue comes when we can't assimilate the energy that's cultivated in that response, in the fight or flight or freeze response. And so we're left holding that energy for whatever reason. There could be many, many reasons for that. But we're left wounded in a way because we're holding the energy that can't be reintegrated back into the nervous system.
Okay. So
I had a question about that because you're talking about the fight or flight response, and that's come a lot in my yoga training. That in fact most of us are. That's like our set point already, just because
Well, it's a
of
part
the
of.
lifestyle we have.
I think many people do live in circumstances where we're kind of ready for fight or flight, and that leads over time can very much lead to post-traumatic stress disorder, where people have nightmares and can't assimilate a horror movie because they're living for a number of years in a situation where they're constantly bombarded with threat. Sexism, for example, racism is one example. If you live in an oppressive society, you're constantly bombarded by that threat, and it might be just minor threat, but if it happens, over the course of years, and collectively there's no way to take responsibility for your feelings about it, or there's no way to assimilate that threat into the nervous system, then that energy gets stored and becomes symptomatic.
Okay. Yeah, I remember we were discussing sometime earlier about different reactions we have to trauma. Like some people disassociate, and then some people get kind of like excited a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, and it
Um,
can fluctuate between the two, hyperarousal and hypoarousal.
okay.
And it can fluctuate between those. And in a half an hour meditation period, somebody could sit in a meditation. They're instructed to follow the breath. Maybe some memories of a traumatic experience arise, and then they go into hyperarousal, and the mind starts to try to comprehend what's happening. Oh, this is painful. Why is this happening? Meditation's supposed to be peaceful, and XYZ, whatever it is, but it's a running dialogue, and it'll feel for that person that they can't catch up. It'll just be this. They might get into a sweat, or they might even really start to experience the physical discomfort of the situation, flashbacks and so forth. Then it might become so intense that they go into hypoarousal, and they just start to dissociate. The body starts to get cold. They start to either fall asleep or just zone out, space out, things like that. And so it can fluctuate.
Are you talking about during the practice?
During a meditation, yeah, it can fluctuate between hypoarousal and hyperarousal. And it can happen also in everyday life experience too, where people will be on the subway, maybe if their traumatic experience that they're struggling with was a death in the family, for example, and somebody walks on the train that looks just like that person, then they'll start to ruminate and start to have flashbacks about how they should have said this to that person or whatever. And so these, challenging emotions will arise, a lot of thoughts, and then they might fluctuate from that into dissociation, zoning out, whatever it is. But the inability to regulate that is really indicative of a person struggling with trauma. Generally, I mean, we all have had, at least I've had that experience where, I come into a situation in my life that is reminiscent of a traumatic situation, and my mind will go into ruminating, or I'll go into the past, or kind of I don't really ever experience that numbing out, but at least ruminating about it. But I can regulate it. I can say, oh, okay, I'm thinking about the past, and I don't need to do that right now. I can be in the present moment, and I can let that go and be with my experience. Generally, people who are struggling with trauma can't do that. The alarm keeps ringing, so to speak.
They can't do what, Chris?
They can't regulate their experience. So
they can't.
So
they can't like observe it. You mean, or?
Yeah, they can't say, oh, okay, this is, now I'm thinking about that traumatic experience, that person who died last week that I miss so much. Now I'm in that experience, and I can, yeah, like you say, observe it. So somebody who has trauma or is struggling with post-traumatic stress, they'll go into that rumination and just be in that. And the whole subway ride might go by, or hours can go by and they'll just be, those thoughts will just be spinning. And the reason is because the nervous system wants to release that trauma. And so when a person is in a zone of safety, they feel safe, they feel they're in a good place in their environment, then the trauma will start to reappear in order to be released. But if that person doesn't have the skills to allow that to happen, they'll be caught in that tailspin. So it'll start coming up, and they'll oh, that's scary, that's painful, I don't want to think about that now, and they push it back down, and then a minute later it'll come back up again, maybe in a different form, and oh, I don't want to feel that, I'll push that down, and it becomes this tug of war in the nervous system like that, and that really leads to a lot of stress and really exasperates the problem.
Okay, so meditation can actually bring about those forms of trauma that pretty much you were talking about, the
Well,
reaction to it.
that's one of the that's one of the cons of meditation with trauma. I actually would like to start by saying that meditation and mindfulness and loving kindness meditation practices in particular can be very healing for trauma and can be a great tool for that. So I'd like to start with that note, because I don't want to downplay the benefits, because it can be extraordinarily beneficial for somebody who has trauma to learn how to self-regulate, and mindfulness can be great for that. It can also be great for somebody who is struggling with trauma to learn how to create an internal safe zone, so that when the trauma does come up, they can start to assimilate that back into the nervous system on their own.
So, Chris, can I just interrupt you before you continue? You mentioned mindfulness, meditation, and loving kindness practice. So can you just briefly describe how those are different or similar?
Sure. Well, mindfulness meditation is the practice of using an anchor to develop awareness of the present moment. And traditionally, that anchor is the breath, but actually, from my own experience, I've noticed that with trauma survivors, the breath isn't always the best anchor. And so I can talk about that now, make a little diversion into that. So the reason that being is that we often hold trauma and stress in our chest area and the abdomen area, around the heart area. So if we're feeling particularly emotionally wounded, asking one to pay close attention to the breath can be triggering. We're bringing them into direct contact with that emotional material. And that's why it often happens that way. When somebody comes to mindfulness practice, they might go to a meditation group saying, oh, this will be good for me. This would be a great way to recover from that car accident I had last week. But then they get into the meditation session and they start following their breath, and their mind is just in the accident the whole time. And it used to be thought, I think, by some teachers that that's a good thing, that that's a way of processing that material. But now, after studies, we know that that's actually, that type of just spinning in that memory is actually re-wounding the meditator. It's like you're just going over it over and over again. It's actually a way of, it opens the wound again. So it actually doesn't help heal in that way. So better, if you're struggling with trauma or heavy emotional material, it's really more productive to start a meditation outside of the body. And so I, in my own practice, when I offer trauma-sensitive mindfulness sessions, I start with the sounds, because there's no threat or danger there, and sounds are always present moment experiences. So I'll have a singing bowl, and I'll ring the bowl several times, allowing the person to really come into the present moment with that sound. Now that creates that zone of safety, present moment awareness, outside of the body gives a person this really firm foundation of safety. And from there, I generally guide one back into the body. Usually I like to then start with the feet, because that's, again, away from that danger zone, away from the emotional material that we might be holding. So starting from the feet and just guiding up through the legs and up through the body. And
So you're
then
talking
by the
about a body
time,
scan.
yeah, through a body scan. By the time we get to the heart area, we're really pretty comfortable with the present moment. Now, at that time, emotional material may arise, but there's generally enough of an anchor in present moment awareness so that material can be assimilated without becoming overwhelming. And that's really the key there. Now, if those memories or if those feelings come up for that person, if they can be with that experience in the present moment, that's where the healing takes place. Because they're not taken away, they're not overwhelmed by it, they're not closing down on that wound. They're feeling the emotional material, but they're also hearing the sound of the birds, hearing the sound of the neighbor's music. They're feeling the rest of their body. And so they can be grounded in present moment awareness, and that emotion can arise. And so that's quite important. And then we continue through the head, and then the last step is to go through the breath. And even then, if I'm sensing the person is quite, holding a lot, I'll just do the breath at the nose, and not to go through the entire breathing process because again, that breath moving through the chest can be so triggering for someone who's holding trauma like that.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned to start the body scan from the feet, because when we do energy work, we focus on grounding. Like, it's really important to ground. Obviously, the lower energy centers are located downwards from the spine and to the feet, and so allowing us to connect to the resonance of the earth actually creates what you're talking about, that safe space where we gradually start, as we anchor in the body, we're more able to start opening up. What happens a lot, and I see this with plant medicine actually, is that the upper gets open, not necessarily the heart, but like the upper energy centers get open, and since there's no grounding in the body and in the physical space, that person can really, have some difficulty integrating that open, wide open consciousness awareness. I don't know if that's similar to what you're talking about.
Yeah, it is. It is. In fact, I think because both experiences, trauma, traumatic stress, and plant medicine experiences can be overwhelming.
Yeah, overwhelming.
And so the idea is to allow the present moment to ground us, as you said, so that we can assimilate what's happening.
So that present moment experience is pretty much where the healing happens?
Exactly. Yeah, present moment awareness is where, because that's the safe zone. Now, the tricky thing about healing trauma through mindfulness or meditation is that present moment awareness can get filtered through danger. Because if somebody has experienced a lot of trauma, they will experience their environment as being, their present moment environment as being ripe with danger.
Threatening.
Somebody who's been living in an oppressive society or in a war zone, for example.
Or in New York City.
What's that?
I said, or in New York City.
I definitely would say New York City, the years following September 11th.
Yeah.
And I think that gets often overlooked. Or in a place that has experienced an earthquake, we often think, well, that moment is the traumatic event, and we often forget as healthcare providers or as healers, we often forget that trauma doesn't end with that one experience usually, but it draws out over days, weeks, months, years. So that has to all be taken into account. And so if somebody's living in that type of environment where they're being bombarded by traumatic stimulus, then when we ask somebody to come into the present moment, that present moment will also be laced with that traumatic stimulus. So we have to be very gentle with that. And so if I'm working with somebody and I know that they're have that kind of background, we've had open conversations about it, I might just do like a 5-minute meditation with that person, or start very light, 5 minutes, 7 minutes, like that, allowing their window of tolerance to just slightly get larger and larger as our sessions progress, like that. So creating that safe zone is really, really important.
I just have a question on about that. Like what I was saying earlier before our call is that 2020 is like a year of trauma. So should we assume that everyone is experiencing some sort of level of PTSD?
Well, I think it's safe to assume that the globe is experiencing trauma on some level. But many people will be able to assimilate that trauma as it arises. Maybe whatever their circumstances are, they have a healthy meditation practice, or they're in a line of work that allows them enough space to feel safe. Then they can go through their day and assimilate what's happening. The recent studies that I've read point to the idea that about 20% of the people who experience a traumatic event will then suffer post-traumatic stress disorder. So that might be 20% of the world's population at this point. Yeah. It might be larger if that capacity to assimilate that trauma gets less and less as the days, the weeks, the months wear on.
And I'm assuming there's also a spectrum, right?
There's a spectrum, yeah. And I think, people of color who live in America right now, they have that trauma because they've been so oppressed over the past hundreds of years, and dealing with police brutality and things like that. So they have that trauma, the trauma of racial oppression, combined with the trauma of COVID-19, combined with the trauma of the political division in that country right now. And so I think for that particular population of the world, assimilating trauma is probably going to be quite a bit more difficult than someone like myself, who lives in Thailand, where there's very little or no COVID-19 for the past 3 months. And I have I spend most of my day in meditation and teaching meditation. So I have these tools, and I live in a comfort zone. So for me, assimilating trauma means reading CNN for half an hour and then going back to my meditation or whatever it is. So it's a lot different.
For sure.
Well, it's a lot different than a person of color living in Los Angeles, for example. And so we have to take all of that into account when we try to estimate the impact of 2020.
Okay. And the number of people that actually experience trauma, we spoke about this before. I just thought it was an interesting number, the percentage that you were talking about.
90%. Yeah, I think it's higher than that. I would have to say, maybe I'm biased.
90% of what?
Of the world's population will experience a traumatic event.
Oh, you mean in general, not just 2020?
Yeah, no, in general, yeah. And I think it's probably higher than that. If we list the examples of traumatic events, it's actually pretty common to see, to witness a car accident, or to be in a car accident, or to witness somebody being, sexually harassed, to witness some sort of racial oppression. When you go down the list, you start to see, well, yeah, I've seen some of that, or I've been a victim of some of that.
Or even just like emotional abuse or bullying, or domestic, violence. It's
absolutely
part of
Yeah, and I'm in lines with that. I was thinking of financial difficulties that people are going through nowadays, divorce.
Financial oppression. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's dark times, 2020 for sure, and I think as care providers that we are, being informed of that is really going to be crucial going forward. At least for me, I've taken a very keen interest in traumatic stress recovery, because I know from my own experience, having lived through September 11th in New York City, how detrimental holding trauma can be. And then being a meditation and mindfulness teacher at the same time, I know how relieving those tools can be. So I've made it a passion of mine to bring that to life for people. Yeah.
And we're very grateful.
Yes, thank you. When I was researching about different ways to approach trauma, I didn't read that much about mindfulness, and I think it's important that we incorporate that into
it does allow us to learn how to self-regulate our emotions. And what's interesting, because the vagus nerve, which runs down the front and the back of the body, which is where our fight and flight and freeze responses arise from, that gets massaged when we breathe deeply. And so kind of running counter to what I said earlier about the breath can be triggering. But when we actually take up a meditation and mindfulness practice, we're actually learning to massage that nerve. And so in doing that, just that process alone of deep breathing mindfully allows the nervous system to relax and to start to assimilate some of that trauma. So right there at the very beginning of taking up a mindfulness practice, the healing starts. And then over the course of time, one learns the skill of being in the present moment more and more, and cultivating that sense of safety more and more. And so trauma can start to really heal like that. I actually have a diagram that I often use when I work with people, and I've prepared it for this session. Now, I'm not sure if you can even see that, or if it's in mirror form. Maybe it might be in mirror form, the writing, unfortunately. But so I'll just explain what it is. It's 3 circles. And so the middle circle, or the first circle here, is the comfort zone. And then the second circle is the challenge zone. And then the last circle, the outer circle, is too hot. And so ideally, when we come to a meditation session, we start within the comfort zone, right? We're getting seated, might be chatting with a friend, getting comfortable on our cushion. Everything is copacetic, right? And then the meditation instruction starts, usually, feel your breath, whatever. That might bring us into the challenge zone. Maybe we're having a lot of thoughts that day, or, maybe we had an interesting conversation with our boss. Our mind is rolling about that, or we want to go see a movie after meditation, so our mind is thinking about that. So then we're working in the challenge zone, and that's good. That's where we want to be. The thoughts come up, we say, oh, I'm thinking, we recognize we're distracted, we return back, and that's where a lot of growth happens, in that challenge zone. Then we might get into the too hot zone. And we know too hot when we start to get emotionally reactive. A person might start to cry, start to have flashbacks of a traumatic situation, start to, or the other way, start to dissociate, start to zone out, then they're in that too hot zone. Now, with somebody with traumatic stress, particularly if they're being instructed to feel the breath right away, they might go from there to too hot, like pretty quickly. And so the idea is to give them the tools to find their way back to the comfort zone and then the challenge zone. And we do that by giving people anchors other than the breath. So as I mentioned, the breath can be triggering. So the sounds, you know, saying if you get distracted in any way, in addition to returning to the breath, you can also return to the sound of the birds, to the sound of the crickets, to the sound of the traffic, to the sound of my voice. Whatever sound is in the present moment. So giving that as an option, or as Wendy was pointing out, grounding, noticing the sensations of feet against the floor, noticing the sensations of your body against the cushion or the chair, and so forth, like that. So present moment physical sensations on the external of the body, really helpful. Clothing on the skin. If there's a fan on, maybe noticing the sensations of the fan, like that, the air against the skin. So giving the person those tools to self-regulate, and then pointing out that those tools are always available. And that's really helpful for people who are struggling with trauma, because they might be on the subway and that person walks by with that reminder of the traumatic stress. Or for me, when I was in New York City, for about 18 months to 2 years after, the smell. From anywhere in Lower Manhattan, you could smell it. And so anytime I was out in Lower Manhattan, I would just start to get triggered. And so, okay, that part of the present moment is triggering. Let me feel the ground against my shoes. Let me hear the sound of the traffic. Let me feel the clothing on my shoulders. Feel the breath, and then I'm back in the present moment, like that. So when we cultivate those tools in meditation, when we give somebody those tools in meditation, if they're struggling with trauma, let them know that they're cultivating those tools that they can use in everyday life, because that makes it really more real for them, and more there's more than desire to cultivate that skill, because then they know that when they leave the meditation, they can use that as a way of beginning to heal in everyday life, not only on the meditation cushion.
Thank you, Chris.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
So
Sure.
Saturday, during our men's circle for October, we'll have a chance to really explore the practice. So I'm really excited about that, going further with all of these tools that everyone really needs. So yeah, looking forward to that. We can talk more about the different aspects of it and really go into a practice with you. Yeah, Mike, did you have anything to add before we see each other again?
No, that's pretty much everything that I thought was important to talk about, and we can dive a little deeper, during the men's circle this
The
upcoming
men's circle.
Saturday.
Yeah. So okay, well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And look forward to our session over Zoom this Saturday for the men's circle.
Sounds good.
Great. We'll see you
Bye,
then.
guys.
Bye. Take care.